Dear Church, as you know, we're in week 5 of a 7-week series studying the book of Ephesians. You can find Ephesians toward the back of your Bible. It's part of the section of the Bible commonly known as the epistles. Ephesians is tucked in between the books of Galatians and Philippians, followed by Colossians. My 7th grade Sunday school teacher taught me to remember the order by this phrase: go eat popcorn. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. Don't say I never taught you anything useful. These little books, epistles, are commonly understood to be letters to small house churches all over Asia Minor, and scholars think that most of them were written by the Apostle Paul, who, after his conversion, spent his time traveling and planting churches. Paul would go into a community and share the message of the gospel with people until a small group of believers had formed, and then he'd go on to the next stop and he'd start all over again. There were no traditional pastors to lead those communities back then, so ongoing supervision, teaching, mediating of problems, that happened by correspondence, by letter. This means, of course, that almost all of these epistles are written to address specific situations about which you and I don't fully know all the details. But we can reconstruct some from the advice that we read in these letters. And let's just be honest, you and I know what it's like to be part of a community of people. Some of that experience is universal. These letters are the closest thing that you and I have to understanding how the first Christian leaders envisioned communities built around the gospel message. See, Jesus certainly didn't leave us an exhaustive manual with instructions for how to institutionalize the gospel message. The first Christians made it up as they went along. The book of Ephesians is part of this little group of epistles, but it's a bit different than some of the others in that scholars think that it actually technically wasn't really written to the Ephesians, and they don't really think it was written by Paul either. The letter to the Ephesians seems a bit more formal than the other letters, and it's more generally applicable, universal. Most scholars think that the book is part of a hymn or a creed or a prayer that was read aloud at the occasion of baptism. It speaks to the fundamentals of how you and I are to live in community as followers of Jesus Christ. So you could say there's probably something in the book of Ephesians for us to learn, dear church. Over these past few weeks, you've heard our preachers talk about the book of Ephesians' beautiful themes of corporate life in the church. Themes like love and commitment and unity, all aspirations for any group who calls itself Christian. But today's passage is meant to make those of us listening feel distinctly uncomfortable because it addresses a topic that nobody likes to talk about and few people do well: church discipline. That is articulating and insisting on a corporate code of behavior that reflects what we say we believe. In writing about this section of Ephesians, most scholars prefer to focus on the part of this passage that addresses anger, as if anger is the biggest problem in the church. Now, anger can certainly be a challenging part of human community, but that's not what this passage in Ephesians is about. This passage is about standards for living in community. It's what we expect from ourselves and from each other. It's what we do in our family, in the family of faith. Speaking the truth, working hard, dealing constructively with anger, engaging in conversations that build up the community instead of tearing it down, staying far away from bitterness and malice, being kind to one another, and living in love as imitators of God. This passage is about boundaries, guidelines, discipline, helping each other uphold the qualities of community that we aspire to, so that the community of Christ in Ephesus or Corinth or Philippi or the Riverside Church can model for the world what it looks like to live out the gospel together. I have a distinct childhood memory of my mother poring over the book Dr. Spock's baby and child care. I'm the oldest of 5 children, so you know she was looking for any tips she could, not to ease the task of forming us into reasonably normal adults, but I think just to keep the peace in the house long enough so she could make dinner. I never read the book, but I presume that Dr. Spock was the one who suggested using the threat of the wooden spoon as punishment for various misdeeds. In our house, we called the kitchen spoon the paddle. Not that I had any personal familiarity with it, of course. By the time I got to the task of parenting, using the wooden spoon as a paddle to discipline children was definitely out of vogue. Instead, all the books that I read said that timeout was the way to go. 1 minute of timeout for every year of life. Regardless of the strategy, the entire point of these discipline approaches and others was to teach a young person what was expected in terms of behavior in the family. As my mother used to put it, we do not behave this way in our family. You could argue with my mom that all the other kids at school got away with it until you were blue in the face, but that did not matter. In our family, we don't do whatever it was I had done, steal my sister's toy. And whenever I put my son Hayden in the timeout chair in the corner of the kitchen for 4 minutes, I said it too. Hayden, we do not behave this way in our family. There are rules for how we behave in this family. This isn't so different from how any human community must organize itself, even and especially the community of Christ. And articulating a standard for behavior in Christian community is exactly what the writer of Ephesians is doing here. How do we want to behave as the church? What kind of interaction shall we have with each other in this family? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus Christ, not just by myself, but in relationship to other people? This is important. It was important for the first Christian communities, which were struggling with how to integrate a Gentile view of the world and the very strong Jewish roots of the Christian faith. Nobody understood each other. They had different expectations, standards of behavior, expressions of community. They didn't get along. But together they had determined to live out the gospel message, and to do that, the writer of Ephesians insisted, no matter what your background is, when you come here to this community, this is how we behave. We speak the truth. We work hard. We deal constructively with anger. We engage in conversations that build up our community instead of tearing it down. We stay far away from bitterness and malice. We're kind to each other. We live in love as imitators of God. We remind each other, this is how we behave in God's family. Now, this has been an interesting year in Hollywood and now in the church world as it relates to the Me Too movement. Me Too is, of course, a movement of women who have gathered the courage to speak out about sexual harassment and abuse they've experienced at the hands of men in leadership. When Me Too first hit the media, I'm guessing that most people in church sat back and watched with detached outrage as Harvey Weinstein and Al Franken and ilk were finally exposed for the many credible incidents of using and exploiting women over whom they had power. But as we saw this week, and as we know from living life in the community of human beings, that kind of scandal is not limited to Hollywood or Capitol Hill. This and other expressions of human frailty happen regularly, even in the church. Willow Creek Church is a non-denominational evangelical megachurch in Chicago. It was founded in 1975 by Bill Hybels, who served as senior pastor there until recently. It's huge. It was known as a center of innovation and training for many in the church world who marveled at its success. Whatever it was doing, it managed to draw in thousands of people who would never consider going to church anywhere else. Willow Creek Church had 3 weekend services averaging 26,000 attendees. It is still one of the largest churches in America. But as you read, this week there was finally a reckoning, a coming to terms with a long-time pattern of sexual harassment and exploitation by the church's pastor. 9 members of the leadership board and 2 other senior clergy resigned this week, saying they had made a mistake by failing to believe the women who had accused Mr. Hybels and by failing to hold him accountable for his behavior. None of the people in leadership, even the other pastors, had the courage to speak up and say, "We don't behave this way in our family." And with no public disavowal of his behavior, anyone looking in from the outside was totally justified in their skepticism of the church. The scandals of the world come to the church. This is nothing new. But it is deeply disappointing when we don't stand up and say, we don't do that in our family. Why? Because the world, especially in the current state of the world, is looking for something, some kind of hope, some kind of promise that human community can be different than what you and I see on the news. There are groups of people marching in Washington, D.C. today, carrying Confederate flags and banners with swastikas on them, spewing hatred and division. Perhaps we as a church can take a tip from a restaurant in downtown D.C. called Lincoln. In preparation for the big rallies this weekend, they posted this on their front door. "You enter here a home where we strive to be the better angels of our nature. We are black and white and brown and yellow. We are women and men, gay and straight. We are old and young, short and tall. We are native and immigrant, resident and visitor. We are Christian and Jewish and Muslim and Buddhist. We are wise and foolish and experienced and green, but above all, we are humans. And yes, we are Americans. As such, Lincoln Restaurant is a house which, divided against itself, will never stand. We are a place of patience, tolerance, acceptance, equality, choice, freedom, opportunity, and love. Come in and join us. But hatred has no welcome solace here." Our world needs to see that kind of community, in a community that includes and heals and nurtures and insists on kindness and hopes together for a better future. If the church will not be that community, then friends, why are we here? Of course, we're not perfect. The church is made up of all of us humans who make mistakes, but we can be different. We can insist that any community bearing the name of Jesus Christ will stand in contrast to the communities of the world. The writer of Ephesians would remind us there are standards for behavior in church, and it's up to us to insist they prevail. Because in the community of Christ, we believe that there is a better way than what we see in the White House or in Congress or at Willow Creek Church. Where are we not speaking the truth? We should have the courage to speak the truth to each other. Where are we coasting? Not working hard to contribute to this community? We need to challenge each other to step up. Where are we misdirecting our anger? Anger can be helpful or destructive. We'll decide that. Where are we engaging in conversations that smack of gossip, that exclude the person being discussed, that tear at our fabric of community? Where in our life together are we expressing bitterness and malice, choosing not to be kind to each other? We're called to live in love as imitators of God. We're tasked with reminding each other this is how we behave in this family. Thanks be to God that I am not currently the parent of young children. So I don't know what the modern equivalent of timeout is, but I do know that it is the task of every generation, parent or church member, to find a way to teach and enforce the standards of the families of which we are a part. The world is watching us. And what it sees often leads the world to believe that nothing about the gospel message can make any bit of difference in the pain and hopelessness of this world. In this moment, especially in this moment when the fabric of our corporate life seems to be tearing at the seams, tending the clear standards of behavior in our community is our work of everyday resistance. It's my way and your way of making a difference in a country and a world that seems lacking in hope. The transformation of our community, of our country, of our world, it begins right here, right here. And the message of Ephesians for us today is this. Dear church, this is your work. It moves you beyond an individual faith into a corporate expression of our shared conviction until all of us can say with strong resolve, this is how we behave in the Riverside family. This is how we behave in God's family. May it be so.